Hello everyone and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. It is high time for another reading wrap-up video. Starting in September of 2023, I stepped away from the monthly reading wrap-ups and decided to name these videos The Treasures of Reading. Every time I feel I have read enough books for an interesting video, I make one. This happens on average every 2 months. In this video, I'm covering all my reads from October 30, 2024 until January the 1st of this new year. All in all, 63 days of reading. Let's start as usual by showing you my overview of the last couple of months. For those of you who are interested, at the very end of this video, I will show all the books I've read since the start of my journey into fantasy, beginning in January of 2023. This overview shows fantasy, literary fiction, non-fiction, and all the other genres I've read. Since October 30, I have finished reading 9 books with a total page count of 4,681. 3 were books of non-fiction and the other 6 were fantasy. Because a few of them were extremely disappointing reads, the average score is 77.6 points out of 100, which is just in the 4-star range. If I were to discard the 2 worst books, the average score would be 87.6 points, a 4.5 stars. To be honest, that sounds a lot more in line with the reading joy I had these last 2 months. The average page count was 520 pages per book, with the smallest counting 109 pages and the biggest 1,308. Let's have a closer look at my reading treasures of the last 63 days. On November 18, I finished reading the 3rd book in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, Oathbringer. And yes, this is the biggest book in this wrap-up, and it's probably the biggest book I've ever read, which is exactly my main beef with this book. I've done an extensive video on my reading experience about this book, where I go into more detail. It is spoiler-filled, but over here I will keep all my comments free of spoilers. It is just a great fantasy book, and for me it is equally good as The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance, the previous 2 in the series. My initial plan to read 1 book in the Stormlight Archive each month didn't work out. The length of the first and the second book didn't really bother me that much, but with Oathbringer it did become an issue. So far, this series has been nothing but memorable and great, but I would highly recommend taking some time off in between the books. Otherwise, Stormlight Archive fatigue may negatively influence your enjoyment. I mean, 1,300 plus pages in a small font size is the equivalent of 5 books. There are many highlights and major reveals in Oathbringer, but one simply doesn't get the build-up and finale of 5 books. Because fatigue was truly looming over my shoulders, I decided to take a longer break in between books. Rhythm of War and Wind of Truth are marinating behind me on my shelves, and as soon as I feel hungry again for more about Dalinar, Kaladin, Shallan, Adolin, Seth, and all the others in the world of Roshar, I will continue with this amazing journey. Oathbringer kept me occupied for 29 days, no less, which is about 2 weeks longer than the other 2 kept me busy. Still, my enjoyment of the book is on par with The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance, 97 points out of 100, which is a solid 5 stars. One of only 7 books in total that scored that high last year. I then read The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. Published in 1924, this book is part of my pre-Tolkien fantasy quest, where I try and get a taste for what fantasy was like before The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. This was a buddy read that I did with Nev from Nev's book channel. On December 13, we did a live stream together on Nev's channel. We talked about Phantastes by George MacDonald and this book by Lord Dunsany. I read the 240 pages within 3 days and I enjoyed it, but not so much that I feel inclined to read more by this author. For one, the writing style is absolutely outdated. Almost every sentence starts with "and then," or "and," or "but," which could have been avoided in practically all cases. On the other hand, the prose was very beautiful, fairy-like and poetic at times. Some pages are written in such an enchanting way that it sucks the reader into the elven way of things in the story. The story about this small kingdom where people long for magic, which they want to import from the nearby mysterious elven land, at times is extremely unrealistic. Even though this is fantasy, the story has to be credible. As a reader, I want to believe that the magical world in the book truly exists somewhere. The king's son, Alveric, goes to the enchanted land to find Lyrazel, the daughter of the elven king from the title. Without many words, courting, or anything really, she immediately decides to go with him to his land. Highly unlikely. Another thing that broke the magic of the story for me are these weird sidesteps the author makes into our realistic world. For instance, Lord Dunsany chooses to mention how one of the unicorns' horn that Orion, the son of Alveric and Lyrazel, was sent as a gift from Pope Clement to the French King Francis I. This is supposed to be written down by the painter Benvenuto Cellini. The writer even goes on to mention the year of this gift, 1513. I mention the date because there are those who care little for a tale if it be not here and there supported by history. It is as if Lord Dunsany here apologizes for writing fantasy. The story would have benefited if he hadn't mentioned this at all. Apart from these few downsides, the exploration in the story of the concept of time is truly captivating, and I remain curious for the rest of the story. With 71 points out of 100, it still scores 3.5 stars. There are just a few more older fantasy books I want to read, but I have a feeling that those will still my hunger for pre-Tolkien fantasy. A good friend of mine sent me this Dutch non-fiction book titled Bloeien in de Bagger by Yoyo van der Kooi, which would translate as To Bloom in the Mud. He was greatly impressed by the spiritual wisdom displayed in this book, and I started to read it with great anticipation. Unfortunately, this book became my biggest disappointment of 2024. I already spent some words on this one in my disappointments video of a few weeks ago. For now, I will only say that of the 240 pages, only about 20 gave me something worthwhile to read. I couldn't give any more points than 32 out of 100, which already feels generous. Thank goodness, it took me no longer than 3 days to read the 256 pages. In the final week of November, I read the first book in the Empire trilogy by Raimond Feist and Janny Wurts, daughter of the Empire. These books have been beckoning me to pick them up since March of 2023. With my reprieve from Stormlight Archive, I could finally respond to this call. I will be doing a separate video on the 3 books, so for now I won't go into too much detail. From the first page until page 528, I was transported to the world of Kelewan, where the people uphold this strict and rather bizarre idea of honor. Written very good, and the political intrigue is very realistically portrayed. The main protagonist, Mara of the Akoma, develops as a character throughout the story, as do the people in her service. With a very high pickup ability, I needed only 7 days to read this story, which has a very satisfactory ending. I fully understand the praise on BookTube, and I will be adding my own very soon. 89 points out of 100, which compares to 4.5 star. a real fun and easy read. After Daughter of the Empire, I immediately picked up the second book in this series, Servant of the Empire. The titles of the trilogy, going from Daughter to Servant and ending with Mistress, already hint that Mara of the Akoma will progress on the political stage of her world. The only thing is that this will unfold in a different way than one might expect after the first book. In Servant of the Empire, something new is introduced, which gives the story more depth than the mere political intrigue it was in the first book. This is what makes this such an interesting trilogy. The second book did have a somewhat slower middle part, where I thought that the book would have benefited from more rigorous editing. Still, with only 1 point less than Daughter, 88 points out of 100 is a high score. The 827 pages took me about 17 days, but I read other books simultaneously. This relatively long reading time doesn't say anything about its pickup ability, which was equally high as the first book. One of the books I read during my Empire reads is this one, Mutant Message Down Under by Marlo Morgan. It is a short book with 187 pages, and I read it in between other reads in 4 days. Now, this book has been labeled as fictional, but there is some dispute about that. I would rather rank it under non-fiction. It is the story of an American woman who comes into contact with one of the last pure Aboriginal tribes in Australia. She's taken in by the tribe and she travels with them through the so-called outback of Australia. During their walk through the desert, she learns their ways and their look upon life and spirituality. Because of protests of the Aboriginal community in Australia, the author was forced to say that all of it was made up and that in truth she had not made this journey with this tribe. Not hindered by any knowledge about this case, I find that hard to believe. What I do believe is that this is one of those few rare books that truly presents a fresh and new look upon the big questions. I may do a separate video at some point, but for now I can say that this is one of my most dear books of 2024. With 96 points out of 100, this book belongs in the illustrious company of my 5-star reads of last year. And in the end, it's not relevant whether this is fiction or non-fiction. The messages displayed in this book are what it's all about. The last non-fiction book on this list I finished reading on December 31st. It is titled True Tales from the Edgar Cayce Archive, and its subtitle is Lives Touched and Lessons Learned from the Sleeping Prophet. It was written by Sidney and Nancy Kirkpatrick, who also wrote the impressive biography of Edgar Cayce. This book is a series of personal portraits of people who were somehow connected to Edgar Cayce. Through 31 chapters, we get a picture of Cayce's life. Every now and then I would read 1 or 2 chapters in between my other reads. Altogether, I spent 29 days with these 366 pages, and like always when reading about Cayce, I was deeply impressed by the stories. Not every chapter interested me equally, but overall, I really enjoyed this book. Most of the content was known to me through the other books about and by Cayce I have read over the years. With 79 points out of 100, this was a solid 4-star book for me. The life of this remarkable seer never ceases to amaze me. Before finishing Mistress of the Empire, which I will talk about in a minute, I inserted a quick read on the final day of 2024. Inspired by many enthusiastic booktubers, I bought The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupery. This really small book was published in 1943, 1 year before the author, who was a pilot, got killed in action during the Second World War. I'm afraid I didn't like it very much. As mentioned in my yearly wrap-up video, I guess I'm not suited for symbolism without a real story. It is a surrealistic, modern fairy tale about this little boy who leaves the small planet he lives on to explore other planets. When he finally lands on Earth, he meets with the narrator, who has crashed his plane in the desert. The adventures of the little prince, as the pilot calls the boy, are mainly symbolic and bereft of any realism. Perhaps that is simply something I cannot appreciate when a reader is supposed to mainly read between the lines, while the actual lines in the book are not that entertaining or understandable for that matter. I have similar problems when I read authors such as Paulo Coelho or Hermann Hesse. They hide a message behind the story they are telling, which most of the time is very thin and obviously secondary. It would seem that I'm interested in storytellers, and that any hidden message will come to me or not. But the hidden message ought to be secondary, or at least not get in the way of the main story. With The Little Prince, that is clearly not the case. Still, glad to have read it, for now I know what this extremely popular book is about. I'm also glad it was this short. I gave it only 54 points, which compares to 2.5 stars. This makes it one of my least favorite books of the year. The next day, on January the 1st, I finished reading Mistress of the Empire, the closing volume in the Empire trilogy. Within 2 weeks, I devoured the 860 pages. As it is supposed to be, this book truly delivered after the build-up in the previous 2 books. Each book in the series ends with a true apotheosis, but the reader knows that there is more to be told. Not in a cliffhanger way, but because some of the story threads need resolving. And with each book, these threads deal with bigger or deeper issues. So the build-up of this trilogy is simply perfect. The writing is beautiful and skillfully done, and the political intrigue as well as the inner reflection of characters and the world they live in are highly entertaining. I have a couple of other videos on the roster, but as soon as I can, I will make a full reading experience about these 3 books. I gave Mistress of the Empire 93 points out of 100, the highest score of the 3 books. They belong to my favorite fantasy series, that's for sure, and I can recommend them to anyone without the slightest hesitation. And now, the slate is clean, with an entire reading year ahead of us. Already I have finished reading 2 books in this new year, and I'm pumped to continue on my reading journey, which takes me places I never could have dreamed I would ever visit. See you again in about 2 months for my next wrap-up. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.